I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. We accelerate ideas into real companies through the Tacklebox membership, and we think through startup strategy every Wednesday on the Idea to Startup podcast. You're here because you're thinking about an idea, or you're ready to launch something, or you already launched something and you're running full steam ahead. We're here to help with the counterintuitive stuff. On to it. Today, we're going to talk about an indispensable method, the always work and never work lists. This method will keep you happy and moving forward despite the nasty little habit of startups and life to try to keep you from doing both. The lists themselves are wildly straightforward, but using them practically is anything but. I think of it like a hike my wife and I went on in the Catskills right after we got engaged. A ranger bounced up to us at the trailhead and said, "Hey, just a reminder, you're in bear country, and we've seen a bunch of bears recently. If you see one, don't worry, they're way more scared of you than you are of them. Just hold your ground or even walk towards them and clap and wave your arms. They'll probably just run away." In a vacuum, walking forward and clapping and waving my arms is something I'm pretty confident I can do. But when there's a 700-pound bear who will, quote, probably just run away, and that is entrepreneurship. You won't have a 700-pound physical bear blocking your path, but that path will be littered with 700-pound mental ones. You've heard the tropes about startups being a mental game, but you don't really know what that means until you're in them. And once you're inside, you realize it's not mental toughness in the can you stay up for another 3 hours and work sort of way. That is easy. Anyone can do that. It's mental toughness in the constantly, relentlessly questioning yourself sort of way. Are you working on the right thing? Does anyone care? Who do you think you are working on this anyway? What are people saying about you? Is this thing actually going to work? Should you quit? Is Deloitte the one that Brian makes fun of in the pod? Maybe you should just apply for a job there. You know, most of these questions are just your subconscious needling you to stop doing what you're doing because starting a business is uncomfortable and your instincts will always be to run away from discomfort. But that doesn't make them any less real, just like how I know on some level that a black bear is just an oversized raccoon, but reality isn't rational. And sometimes your subconscious is right. Sometimes the thing you're working on is systemically flawed and you should stop doing it. And sometimes you should run away from a bear. So we need a system to deal with the self-questioning. We talk a lot about methods on the pod, and to remind you, a method exists to solve a hard problem, to answer a hard question. In this case, the method can answer lots of questions, startup or not, but this is a startup pod, so we'll tackle the biggest startup question it attacks first. Is this idea that I'm working on actually good? Or the more evolved, urgent version of that question, when you've come around to realize firmly that this idea, this thing you're working on, as currently constructed, isn't good. It isn't going to work. Now what? I get asked both flavors of this question weekly from Tacklebox members, the "is this good" version and the "this isn't good, now what" version. For the founders, this conversation is cataclysmic. The thing that is so important to them that they've folded their entire self-worth into like strawberries into an angel food cake on the Great British Bake Off, it isn't working, and maybe it never will. How do they move forward with this knowledge? It's heavy. But for me, that's just Thursday. Every founder hits this moment, and we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of them. So this happens a lot, and we have a process for it. General life advice: find people who, to them, your biggest problem is just a regular Thursday. Therapists, coaches, whoever. Find people with broad context for the big things we face in life only once or twice. Anyway, members show up to our meetings distraught, barely able to mutter that their idea isn't working. It always reminds me of that scene in Goodfellas where a teenaged Henry Hill gets arrested for the first time for trafficking cigarettes, and he's despondent because he thinks he's going to get kicked out of the mob. But after he gets let off by a crooked judge, the whole gang is there, laughing and smiling and punching him in the arm. Robert De Niro's character shoves a wad of cash in his pocket and congratulates him. "You took your first pinch like a man," he says, "and you learned the two greatest things in life. Never rat on your friends and always keep your mouth shut." Getting pinched is, apparently, part of being in the mob. And while we got a bit off track here, you can probably still follow the line I'm trying to draw. That moment when it feels like your idea is toast or where you're questioning yourself or you hit some sort of wall, that is part of it, a huge part of it, a massive opportunity. And you need a system for this moment because the hard moments are the moments you're closest to something interesting, the moments you're ready to change and try something different, the moments where 95% of other people are going to quit. And that is where the always work and never work lists come in. These exist for the moments when you're stuck or frustrated or questioning what you're doing. They help you get to the bottom of the problem, and they help you get momentum one way or the other. We'll start with a story about how to use these lists, then we'll lay out how to build and use your own lists. So let's get into it. After a little smooth jazz, which wasn't in the episode last week, and people were pissed. I got a bunch of emails about it. Sheesh, forgot to edit it in. This podcast is free, you know. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job and want to test out the former before you leave the latter, come and work with us. Apply at gettacklebox.com. Over 400 startups have tested and built ideas through our program, and those businesses are now collectively worth over $1 billion. Our program helps you prioritize and execute, and our members and me and the team keep you accountable and give you feedback along the way. Come build with us at gettacklebox.com. Should I stop doing this podcast? Today's example was supposed to be about a founder that's currently in the program and has run into the "this thing isn't working, now what" wall. But as I was mapping that out, I realized there might be a better example. Me. It's easier to write about myself anyway, and this shows that these types of moments, the ones where you question yourself and what you're doing, are as regular a part of entrepreneurship as answering emails. I'm 9 years into Tacklebox and almost 4 years into Idea to Startup, and the self-questioning has increased, if anything, which I wouldn't put on a brochure trying to attract new entrepreneurs, but it's true. So here's the story. I go through ebbs and flows with this podcast. I love writing it and thinking through it. I love that it attracts the right types of founders to Tacklebox. I love the emails I get from people saying it's helpful or asking for pictures of Ruby. I love the way it helps me see the world. I apply our frameworks to everything, from coffee shops to penny vodka to exterminators. It's fun. But I hate the numbers. The numbers weigh on me. Because no matter what happens, I'm upset. If they go up, the downloads, I'm upset they didn't go up more. If they don't go up, I definitely get upset about that too. Since the ceiling is infinite, it sort of messes with me. More is always better, and more is always relative, so you're screwed. There's never enough. I know I shouldn't look at these numbers, but I do. And practically for advertising and for our core business, basically nearly every member comes from the pod, the numbers matter. But apart from the number thing, I also think about the opportunity cost of the pod. It takes roughly 2 days a week to do the podcast. If I just stopped, what could I do with those 2 days? Could I grow the business faster a different way? Do I even want that? So let's rewind to a few weeks ago when I was wondering for the 700th time if the podcast was even worth it, if I'd ever grow to a place where I'd be happy with it, if that place even existed. When I have these big questions, the doubts about my business, I turn to one place, the always and never work lists. The process. Linguini, my internal system, is completely run in Notion and has a specific section for the things that always work and the things that never work lists. That main page has a bunch of subpages, examples of previous times that I worked through something hard using this system. They've got a date and a title. I look through them frequently, especially when I'm making the type of decision I've already made in the past. When I create a new page for a new decision, a template pops up with 3 simple prompts to start the process. Prompt number 1 reads, "What's the problem, big guy?" And then there's a little pouting face emoji. I don't remember when I first added big guy to the prompt, but I always forget about it, and it always makes me smile because it lightens the mood. It makes me feel like a kid with a silly problem, which is usually what's going on. This is where I write a sentence or a paragraph. For the podcast decision, I was brief. I wrote, quote, "I'm just not sure I want to do the podcast anymore. I'm not sure it's worth it. I wonder if it's actually holding the business back." On to prompt number 2, which is actually a set of 5 prompts, the classic Toyota 5Y framework. It helps you cut through anything superficial and get to the root cause, the thing that's actually upsetting you. So I started with the problem, I'm not sure the podcast is worth doing, and I asked, why? I first answered because the pod isn't growing in a way that could support a big business. Why? Because I don't prioritize podcast growth and haven't spent the time to figure out a coherent growth strategy. Why? Because I'd like to think the podcast is good enough that it can grow on its own without a bunch of marketing. Why? Because I don't like the idea of marketing and pushing myself out like a car salesman all over the place and joining podcasts and having other people as guests that didn't want guests in the first place and all of that freaking nonsense. Why? Because maybe I'm worried that if the podcast gets bigger, the fraud police are finally going to show up at my door and handcuff me and take me away. Or people won't like it and I'll get lots of bad reviews, or something else equally as silly and unlikely. If you go through all 5 of the whys, you're almost certainly ending up at some sort of emotional blocker or some flavor of imposter syndrome, which is totally fine, but usually not all that actionable for our purposes, though a therapist might help. It's always good to know that the root of your inaction is usually just self-sabotage, a fear of success for no other reason than success is scary and different from what you've historically had, and people don't like different. But if we roll back into the more actionable whys, something kind of obvious jumps out immediately. I've never had a coherent growth strategy because I just haven't. I hope the pod would grow on its own, and it has. It's grown a lot. But if I want to anchor the type of business I want to build, it's got to grow way more. And I haven't had a coherent or any strategy. So it's not that it can't grow, it's that I haven't really tried. The first 2 prompts nearly always bring you to some sort of epiphany. And the one I wrote down was, quote, "So I'm upset about pod growth, but haven't ever really tried to make the pod grow. That seems dumb." And that is why I say big guy, because most of our biggest problems or insecurities or questions, when whittled down, are silly, fixable things. To quote the immortal Taylor Swift, I stare directly at the sun, but never in the mirror. Which brings us to prompt number 3. What would you suggest to someone who came to you with this problem? Again, this usually ends up being surprisingly straightforward. And I wrote, quote, "I'd suggest they start trying lots of things to make the pod grow, to reprioritize growth as the number one thing for a month or a few months to see if the pod is actually capable of growing at a rate that can support a bigger business." Which brings us to our lists. The things that always work and the things that never work lists. Now, finally, we get to the actual lists. These lists started years ago as part of a journal prompt I'd use at the end of each day. It might have come from James Clear or Shane Parrish, or maybe I made it up, I forget. It lived on my to-do list and simply said what worked today and what didn't. I'd reflect on the day and put stuff down. After a week or 2, I started referencing the past few days each morning, looking for things I should and shouldn't try to do that day. To make this easier, I started compiling the best ones into lists. Those lists have grown, and now they have categories. So, for example, I have a big list of general things that always work and never work, but then smaller sections with things that work for growth or product or diet or sleep or happiness. A few years back, I heard a line from Naval Ravikant that stuck with me and inspired these lists. I'll probably butcher the quote, but it said something like, he'd want to create a life where in 1,000 parallel universes, he'd be successful and happy in 999 of them. So that was the hope, to find the things that if you do them, always or almost always lead to really good outcomes. This might seem silly, but as I look through the list, I see things I should do and should think about, but don't. We, or at least I, need constant reminders, especially because most of these things are counter-instinctual. They're uncomfortable, so my mind and body are naturally pushing away from them. So, back to the podcast. I'm frustrated about growth, which means I need to look at the general section of the lists and the growth section of the lists. When I did, a few things popped out immediately. First, from the general things that always work list. Work different rather than just harder in the same way. Well, I've been absolutely killing myself to put out the same structure podcast for years with zero focus on growth. The definition of working harder in the same way rather than working different. So a different structure might push on growth. Next. Fast forward to the end, describe the moment of wild success, and then build a plan backwards from that moment. I haven't ever defined what wild success is for the podcast, so I can't possibly be building towards it. This is almost certainly why it all feels so unfulfilling. Next. Focus on raising the ceiling, not the floor. I've thought a lot about keeping existing listeners rather than finding pockets of new ones. This is a mistake. Take on ambitious projects with public accountability. Well, that's what I'm doing right now. Pay for momentum for something you've been stuck on for a while but know you need to do. I've known about marketing for this for a while. Paying to get the ball rolling, overpaying for momentum for something would have made a ton of sense, but I haven't done it. All the value is in the last 15%. Most people get 85% of the way there with marketing and then stop because the last 15%, really sharing what you've created, is uncomfortable. You got to push through it to get those 10x results, and I haven't. There were a ton of others that gave me ideas, and we could probably stay here all day, but I want to move on to the growth section of things. I'll read these out quicker, and you'll see a theme is going to pop out. Use niche channels and painfully specific problem messaging. Help a few customers be wildly successful and then help them share that success. Find hub and spoke channels and give the hub something valuable they'd share with the spokes organically anyway. Use opportunity thinking. Think about how to get hundreds or thousands of new customers irrationally excited with something big and unique. The 15th idea, not the first, is going to work, so don't get discouraged. Build structure. Try 1 or 2 new things in 2-week sprints over the course of 3 to 6 months. Track metrics that help you make decisions and move the bottom line, not vanity metrics. Every metric you track should be helping you to make a decision. So the takeaways: be creative, be specific to customers, spend the time to get into niche channels, figure out ways to provide more value and do it in a structured, data-driven, long-term way. Finally, on to everything that jumped out from the things that will never work list. Waiting for people to come to you or notice the good work you've done does not happen. Building content that is, quote, so good people just show up doesn't happen. Marketing agencies don't work if you're spending less than $20,000 per month. Social ads don't work if you're spending less than $20,000 per month. Getting upset and stopping when the first 5 things don't work. There, again, were a bunch more that resonated, but I know listing stuff out isn't the best podcast content. I'll probably publish my list of things that always work and things that never work at some point. Email team@gettacklebox.com if you'd like to get them when I do. The next step is to think up a plan, a bunch of tests to try to navigate the problem. For the podcast, I realized my biggest problem was getting 85% of the way there and stopping. I did all of this work, writing and recording the episodes, then gave them zero leash to grow. So I came up with 25 ideas for growth. Everything from cold emailing the head of the entrepreneurship club at every college and business school in the country, sharing the podcast and offering office hours, to something a bit more radical that I think I might actually try. Lots of founders have reached out after listening to the pod and sent their strategies after I've had an episode on growth or product or some other framework. Lots of these are really great. What if instead of spending $5,000 on a growth agency one month, I just gave the $5,000 away to whoever I thought had the best idea for a growth strategy for their startup, or for whoever I thought had built the best approach for pursuing their idea? The $5,000 would help them sprint for a month. Then I could do a podcast with them and see how it went. Or maybe it's $1,000 and we have 5 monthly winners. To enter the contest, maybe you have to get some number of people to engage with a post or share an idea to startup thing or something I haven't totally thought through yet. But the idea hits a lot of the things that have worked in the past. I've built out a structure to test these in 2-week sprints until the end of the year, with clear growth targets and the plan to test out 15 wildly different approaches. And I've budgeted an amount of money each month to put towards making each test easier, whether that's outsourcing design or copy or video tools or research. I am willing to overpay for momentum because that works. You. There are 3 huge benefits of the always work and never work lists. The first is awareness. They shift you from someone inside your business struggling to someone outside your business consulting. You're able to figure out the root cause of your problem. The second is momentum. Once you've figured out the problem and seen a bunch of inspiration for what works, you are way more likely to build a plan to navigate it. And the third is reference, a catalog of decisions you made in the past that you can look back on. Now, when I get frustrated with the pod's growth in 6 months, I can go back and see my thought process around this decision. I can see if anything's changed. I can try different growth tactics or maybe decide to scrap the thing entirely. This type of decision log gives you critical insight into your decision-making process. It lets you build a system around decisions, lets you practice them, rather than just making them haphazardly. The end. I read a stat the other day that 90% of people over the age of 30 will never sprint again. They'll never run onto a field and kick it into their highest gear. This has stuck with me for some reason. It just seems so upsetting, I guess, because my son is 18 months old and literally all he wants to do is sprint. If he's 10 feet away and has to come over to get some puffs, he's sprinting. I'm not sure he even knows how to walk. The point of this type of framework is to help you sprint in the startup or life sense, to figure out what you want and to go after it in a meaningful, purposeful way, in a way that can work. Mixed into the lists are things I've noticed our most successful founders do. One of them stands out. They fear mediocrity more than they fear failure. And that is a good place to end here. Most people won't make lists of things that work and things that don't. They won't reference them to make hard decisions. They won't log those decisions so they get better at them. They won't recognize how important all of this is. They won't sprint. But maybe you will. Never rat on your friends, always keep your mouth shut, and make the always work and never work lists, or something like that. Have a great week. This was the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job, head to gettacklebox.com and apply. We'll get back to you in 72 hours and can be working together by the weekend.